romance and historical romance. So what a deal. I've spent, as Linda said, I've spent most of my career writing for children. But we've also, with Edith, I've written these 2 grammar books, and we're at about 150,000 copies sold. And we had the idea to make a grammar book that was funny and approachable. And that was based on our class at San Diego State. And through this book, my biography of Pinkerton, what Linda said is true. Sometimes adults read these books, and that happened with this, and because of that I was on A&E Biography and Discovery. And I said, well, you do know this book is for children, but they wanted to know someone who knew something about this man who was the first private detective. And then this is another book that Edith and I wrote together about the wonderful man in Mexico who has created so many schools in the Tijuana garbage dumps and in the dumps of Nicaragua. This was on CBS this morning this week because a teacher was holding it up and saying, this is one of my favorite books, so we were very excited. Now, the book that I just am publishing represents a whole new direction for me, but writers, as a lot of you know, thrive on new directions. So I love to read fiction, I love to read family sagas, I love to read historical fiction, and I'm nuts about history because I think people's lives are more interesting than anything I could make up. So almost 20 years ago, when I discovered these courting letters that were in an antique writing box, and just a cursory reading made me know this was a story. These 2 people, Gertie and Fred, were communicating between Ipswich, England, and St. Paul, Minnesota, and all they had to communicate with were letters. Now today, a young couple who are courting, dating, they have multiple ways to communicate. These 2 had only letters, and this went on for a year and a half. So I knew I had a story. Now I began by thinking, okay, I'll just transcribe the letters. Well, Fred wrote 16-page letters, single-spaced. Gertie wrote letters with a handwriting that is much worse than mine, and I had to sort of learn a new language. I had to learn what was an A and what was an O because she never closed up the letters, and she would write up the side of a piece of paper and down the other side, and then she'd move on to programs from plays in these letters that she would write back to him. So I decided that transcribing every single word of these letters, I would have left this earthly veil by the time I finished. So I started taking excerpts, and I looked for excerpts that would be able to be moved into a narrative scene, and based on hints in the letters. Now, in the meanwhile, this was 19 years ago. In the meanwhile, I wrote a bunch of other books, but these people kept tapping me on the shoulder saying, when is our turn? When are you going to write about us? So finally, 3 or 4 years ago, I said to myself, I'm going to do this. I'm just going to not do anything else. I'm going to do this book, and that's what I did. William Faulkner once said, if a story is in you, it has to come out. So I decided it had to come out. Now, my daughter, who is the illustrator of the book and my marketing director, yeah, she had the idea, Mom, why don't you interweave a modern girl's story to build contrast? And I thought that was a very good idea. So I chose 2010 for the modern girl because it's already happened. So I knew that new things wouldn't happen. It had already happened. So that way things could be mentioned that had already happened, like an earthquake in Haiti and the oil rig explosion in the Persian Gulf, these things. And I also chose a location, Chicago, because I've lived there. So I knew the city, but of course I had to update it because I've lived here a long time. So there were many contrasts between the two stories, what people wore, how they communicated, how information is disseminated, and I wanted to really emphasize that. Now, Chicago I also know because in 2 of my books I've had to write about the Chicago fire of 1871. So I've got the Chicago fire down pat. But that doesn't really help me for 2010, but that's another thing I knew about. So the book begins with Lisa in 2010. I'm just going to give you some sneak peeks from the book. Lisa studied the unfamiliar handwriting scrawled on the label of an antique writing box. Courting letters. Courting letters? She had only seen that word in the period novels she loved to read. Whose? She asked the attic rafters. In the cluttered space of her parents' St. Paul, Minnesota home, she had discovered 2 thick piles of letters. Both exuded the musty scent of age. Having arrived during the depths of a bitterly cold winter, Lisa had donned layers of clothing before climbing the attic stairs. In her bulky sweater, hooded jacket, stocking cap, and boots, she felt like a moose trampling through brush. How many know what that's like in the depth of winter? How many have lived in a winter climate? Okay. So she finds the letter, she waits for her airport shuttle, and she gets on her airplane. Contrast right there. Now we fast forward backward to 1907. And I found a photo of the very street on which Gertie and Fred met. And then my artistic director found a way to make it look really fantastic. So to illustrate that chapter, that's what we used. And I'm going to pass around a notebook. You want to pass this around? Because she used, along with these letters, I found a treasure trove of, and this is just a little bit of it, of things from that era that could be worked into these illustrations for chapters. So now we're in 1907. The bell jangled as Fred entered the Livick drapery shop. A short young woman stood behind the counter, fine-boned with a mass of auburn hair piled atop her head, her ruffled white blouse tapered to a waist so narrow Fred's hands might fit around it. Her blue eyes welcomed him, warm, direct. "Good day, sir. May I help you? Are you Mrs. Livick?" "Miss Livick," she said. "This is my father's shop." Gertie offers to pass Fred's name on to someone who can help him find a flat to let in Ipswich, because he's just come down there to work in a grocery store. So she tucks the paper into her reticule. In case you don't know what a reticule is, it's what the ladies wore around their waist with a small purse, very decorated. Yes, she very much would like to meet Mr. Wigington again. Now, Fred's thinking about her, too. That night, sleep wouldn't come for Fred. Something about Miss Livick's physical presence spoke to him. She seemed so different from other young women. Rather than presenting herself as simpering, cloying, and manipulative, as some women did, Miss Livick seemed to have a merry, feisty temperament and an independent streak. So, they've taken notice of one another in a 1907 way. Now, of course, there have to be obstacles. The distance is one obstacle, and just as their friendship deepens into something more, he immigrates to America because of financial problems, and he finds out that there are jobs in St. Paul. So here he is in Montreal, Quebec, and I had to consult a train expert to find out what train he would have taken, what would be the route. It would be through Michigan. The train's steam engine chuffed as it pulled out of the Montreal, Quebec station. The rhythmic clackety-clack of wheels against rails reverberated and in Fred's head as the engine built up speed. The farther he journeyed away from Gertie, the worse he felt. Those last few days in Ipswich, he had thought he might go mad. Gertie flitted about in his mind constantly. Why didn't I tell her how I feel? I should have said something, but I have nothing to offer her. Have I left England forever? Will I never see Gertie again? Did I leave my heart behind? I wish I knew. Now, in the modern story, Lisa and Mario meet, and just to add a little twist, she thinks he's pretty special, but he gets sent back to his native Spain. So she's all upset about that and has a big conversation with her mother's good friend. Other obstacles pop up for Gertie. Fred's worrying about money. That's a big issue. So on New Year's Eve in St. Paul, Minnesota, Just before midnight, Fred stepped out alone from the warmth of the flat into the frigid air. He buttoned his coat, pulled his cap flaps down over his ears, and wrapped his wool muffler around his throat. Even with his gloved hands shoved into his pockets, icy cold froze his nose inside and out, remember that? And slithered up his sleeves. Stars studded in the heavens, and a waning silvery moon hung in the sky, glittering on the river. I had to check the moon cycles for that day of the year in 1907 or 8. On the stroke of 12, bells all over the city of St. Paul began ringing. Church bells, handbells, and the booming city hall chimes. A new year, 1910. What would it hold for him, for Gertie? He hoped for great changes, but the ocean that lay between them posed a daunting challenge. Was Will right, Will's his brother? If Fred wanted Gertie, and he did, he would have to act, and soon money be damned. Now, how he wished he could lift just one corner of the curtain that veiled what was to come. So distance and separation are working in both stories. In Lisa's case, it's an old boyfriend who suddenly reappeared. For Gertie, it's Mr. Forbes. She and her mother are renting a room to Mr. Forbes. Gertie tells her mother that Malcolm Forbes has asked her if she would begin walking out with him. That was the equivalent of dating. Mr. Forbes is a nice chap, says her mother, cultured and handsome. He's quite well fixed, I gather. I don't really care about that part, Mother. You should care. How old is he? 45. He married early and his wife died. So, her mother says, now you're torn between a man 5 years younger and thousands of miles away and a man 8 years older who lives a train ride away. So her mother's not sure she's making the right decision. So the contrasts were modes of communication, technology, but one of the most interesting ones was women's rights and freedom. I wanted the contrast between Lisa's freedom to be an independent woman, despite her troubles in the dating world, and Gertie's restraint at telling Fred her own feelings, plus people criticizing her for refusing to marry someone she didn't love. So Lisa's thinking, how am I doing on time?
You have 12 minutes.
Okay, good.
Great.
All right. What would Gertie and Fred think of this rapid-fire modern world of electronic dating, so different from the time in which they had lived? Today, both men and women fudged their height, weight, education, and age, and wrote whatever dumb thing came into their minds. Plus, with the click of computer keys, the internet made it possible for men and women to communicate with more than one person at a time. So Lisa's thinking, I'm just one small soup can on a grocery soup aisle filled with an array of brands. Why pick me? So Gertie, in her time, is thinking also, and she says, Gertie cared about Fred so deeply, yet often stopped herself from putting her true feelings into words in letters, afraid to trust him. Instead, she affected a light, carefree tone when she wrote. When I was reading this to my critique group, a couple of the members said, well, Gertie sounds kind of flighty and, a little bit lightheaded. But that was what she was supposed to do because you couldn't commit yourself. So she says, men had the best of it. Women, relegated to loving someone but not showing it, must wait to put their true feelings into words until asked to be someone's wife. At another point, she says, when Mr. Jones, who is also renting a room from her, and he fancies her as well, he's off to a men's-only meeting at church. Gertie writes to Fred, how I wish I were a man. Now, he probably was glad that she wasn't. So Wallace Stegner, a writer, historian, winner of the Pulitzer Prize, said, any life will provide the material for writing if it is attended to. So what I've done here is I attended to the lives of these two real people. And then I also attended to the two that I made up. And that was a very interesting and intriguing process. So this was probably one of the hardest books I've ever written. And it was because I was trying to have two plots. But I wanted to show you the notebook that's coming. I wanted to show you some of these illustrations that my artistic director came up with, my daughter, because she has a graphics background. This was based on a luggage tag that I found. This I ordered from Canada, which is the actual ship that he came over on. And then some of these came, I guess I shouldn't go far afield here. Some of these came from postcards. There was a postcard, and I looked for the copyright of the postcard booklet, and the company is no longer in existence. But, so she took a little part of the postcard, and then these are the actual letters. And you can see how neat Fred's writing is compared to Gertie. And then for the modern girl, she had it look completely different with just each chapter looking somewhat the same. And here's another. I had a book of baritone solos because Fred was a singer, and so I had stuff about music for him. And here's another. This was the River Gipping that Gertie used to take walks on in Ipswich. And here was a painting done by Gertie that each chapter had an inset, and then I guess it's called relief or something. But so it was really fun to create these openers. This is a postcard from the postcards from the early 1900s were gorgeous. They really were. I mean, this is a postcard that someone had written on the back of. Here's another one, which was perfect, because here's this couple at dinner having a smooch, and here's the maid and the butler in the background doing the same thing. So that worked quite well. And then this one I love too. She took a picture of our antique clock, and then we found this train photo in the Minnesota Historical Society. I worked with a lot of historical societies to gather all this stuff. There was a lot of research involved, and my husband, my research assistant over here, did a lot of helping at finding the little nitty-gritty stuff that might be in a birth registry or a mistake that we made. He was one of my readers. And that was another thing. With this book, I had about 15 readers, which helped a lot. Okay. All right, so thank you. Sherry, you're on. Yeah. I am. I have it at home. In fact, initially I was going to do it that way, but